Steam covers the mirror, water hits the tiles. You reach for the shampoo, then, without warning, "That's not what I said." You stop. No one is there, but the conversation has already begun. "No, that's not what I meant," they answer, not out loud, not in the room. But you know exactly what they would say, because they said something like it 3 days ago. Only then, you didn't have this answer. The real argument moved too quickly. They spoke. You hesitated. You tried to explain. They interrupted. You got frustrated. And somewhere between understanding what they meant and deciding what to say next, the moment passed. The argument ended. Your response never arrived. Until now. Standing under running water, doing something completely unrelated, the sentence appears with almost insulting clarity. Of course, that's what I should have said. So you try it. They push back. This time, you have an answer. They object. You counter. And suddenly, an argument that ended 3 days ago is happening again. Except now, you're winning. The strange part isn't that you remembered it. The strange part is what your mind does next. It edits the conversation, changes your response, predicts theirs, then generates another response to that. Nothing you say in this shower can change what happened 3 days ago. And yet your operating system is still spending resources on the case. Why? This is case file 4. Initial classification, overthinking, possibly anxiety. A human replaying an unpleasant event, generating emotional responses to something that no longer exists. Simple enough, except the diagnosis had a problem. Timing, because the response you wish you had made has an inconvenient habit. It arrives late, 10 minutes later, 3 hours later, sometimes 3 days later, in the shower, driving home, brushing your teeth, getting ready for bed, usually while doing something that has absolutely nothing to do with the argument. And when it arrives, almost everyone asks the same question. Why didn't I think of that then? So I reconstructed the original encounter. During the actual argument, your brain wasn't solving one problem. It was solving several. Listen to the words, interpret the meaning, read the expression, monitor the tone, control your own reaction. Remember what happened before. Decide what matters. Construct a response. Deliver it. Then do it all again while the conversation continues moving. There is no pause button, and emotion makes the available bandwidth even smaller. A raised voice captures attention. An accusation pulls you towards defense. A surprising remark forces you to update your understanding while you are still trying to answer. So, perhaps the perfect response wasn't unavailable because you were incapable of producing it. Perhaps it simply lost a competition for limited attention. Then the argument ends. The pressure disappears. Hours later, you're under warm water. The shower doesn't interrupt you. It doesn't misunderstand your tone. It doesn't become offended. Your attention is no longer occupied by the encounter, and internally generated thought has room to wander. Details reconnect. Alternative interpretations surface, and a sentence that couldn't win the competition earlier finally has space to appear. There it is. The comeback. The explanation. The thing you should have said. But this is where the case becomes interesting, because your mind doesn't simply find the better answer and close the file. It puts the answer back into the argument. They respond. You respond to their response. They object. You adapt. And suddenly, the conversation has moved beyond anything that actually happened. A memory has become a rehearsal, which creates a much stranger question. If yesterday cannot be changed, what exactly are you rehearsing for? The first clue was that this behavior does not require a previous argument. Before a job interview, you imagine difficult questions. Before asking for a raise, you rehearse objections. Before confronting a friend, you predict denial, and before sending an important message, you imagine the reply. Different situations, same operation. The system takes what it already knows and asks, what could happen next? And to do that, it needs something surprisingly sophisticated. A model of another person. Not just their words, their perspective. What will they notice? What might offend them? What will they misunderstand? How do they usually react when challenged? That is why the imaginary version of someone can feel so convincing. They interrupt in believable places, defend familiar positions, repeat old habits. Sometimes they produce a response you did not consciously expect. Your brain can construct a version of another person convincing enough to make you angry at something they have not actually said. Curious. In all honesty, I had believed the initial hypothesis. Overthinking, anxiety, a mind stuck replaying an event it could not release. But that explanation was incomplete, because the same machinery appeared outside anxious moments, before interviews, negotiations, or difficult conversations, even while trying to predict how someone else might react to something we hadn't said yet. This wasn't enough to rule anxiety out, but it was enough to tell me anxiety wasn't the whole mechanism. I noted this across enough cases that I became, frankly, skeptical of my own initial reading. This is where the original diagnosis began to collapse. Random noise does not usually behave like this. This had structure, inputs, alternatives, predicted responses. The system appeared to be modeling possible social futures, which meant I needed to find the machinery capable of turning memory into prediction. For a long time, it was tempting to think of the brain at rest as exactly that, at rest. But a quiet person does not necessarily contain a quiet mind. This is the part I keep returning to, if I am honest about it. When immediate external demands fall away, internally generated thought continues. Memories return. Possible futures appear. Other people's perspectives are modeled. Alternative decisions are tested. Research on internally directed thought points to interacting brain networks, including what researchers call the default mode network, that participate in autobiographical memory, imagining possible futures, and thinking about other minds. Not a single switch, not a special shower mode, but the ingredients of this case that kept appearing together. Memory, imagination, social knowledge, prediction. And once I stopped treating them as separate clues, the mechanism became easier to see. Consider the shower again. Memory supplies the argument. You replace your original response. Imagination generates what might happen next. Your model of the other person supplies a reaction. You answer. Another branch appears. The system is no longer retrieving a recording. It is constructing a scenario. Yesterday's conversation has become training data. For the purposes of this investigation, I needed a name for that process. The conversation simulation engine. Not a literal machine hidden inside the skull, a working model for what several interacting systems appear capable of doing together. But there is a structural problem with the simulation engine. You have unusually good access to one side of the conversation. Yours. You know what you meant, what you felt, what you were trying to say. The other side is different. You have behavior, history, tone, a limited sample of previous interactions, and then inference. So every time the model generates their next response, uncertainty remains. They could become defensive, apologize, or misunderstand you completely, and every possibility creates another branch. Perhaps that is part of what makes some conversations so difficult to close. The one piece of data that could collapse all those possibilities, what another person will actually think or say, is unavailable until reality supplies it. And once you see it that way, the scale changes. Imagine one conversation suspended in front of you. You speak. The other person replies. Then the conversation splits. In one version, they become defensive. In another, they apologize. And yet, in another, they misunderstand you completely. Each response creates another decision. Explain, withdraw, escalate, repair. Each decision creates another branch. One conversation becomes 10. 10 become hundreds. Most disappear before you consciously notice them. A few remain. The emotionally important ones. The unresolved ones. The ones your mind reopens while the rest of you is trying to wash your hair. And now the late comeback makes more sense. The new sentence is not merely a correction. It changes the simulation. Change your response, and their predicted response changes too. So, I should have said this, becomes, if they had answered that, then I would have said this. And eventually, if this ever happens again, I'll be ready. The system crossed from reconstruction into rehearsal without announcing it. And the more I examined that rehearsal, the less it looked like a machine for winning arguments, and more like a machine for reducing uncertainty. What if they get angry? Or they deny it? What if I freeze? What if they apologize? The engine cannot know which future will happen. So, it generates possibilities. Most will be wrong. That does not necessarily make them useless, Their value may lie in making a possible situation less novel if something similar happens in reality. Let's run a simulation. Consider a hypothetical subject. I'll call them K. K had a disagreement with a manager over the framing of a report. A comment in a review meeting, delivered flatly, 30 seconds long. K spent 9 days on those 30 seconds. The manager said this, K said that. The manager pushed back. K found the right response. The manager revealed they had meant something slightly different. K had a response for that too. By the time the real conversation happened, K had rehearsed it approximately 18 times. The actual exchange lasted 6 minutes. The manager had largely moved on. They agreed on a change quickly. The conversation ended without incident. 18 simulations, 6 minutes, no meaningful overlap between what was rehearsed and what occurred. I find that quite interesting. What interests me is not that the simulations were inaccurate, prediction systems frequently are. What I find interesting is what K reported in the aftermath. Not relief, a kind of cognitive vertigo. The engine had run at full intensity for 9 days, and the data it needed to resolve, the actual conversation, made almost none of that output usable. One detail from the simulation didn't fit. I've isolated it for later, and will return to it before this file closes. But there was still a problem. Why should the human operating system care this much about social uncertainty? Why devote all this effort to another person's tone, approval, anger, or rejection? To answer that, the investigation had to leave the shower, leave the office, the smartphone, and look at a problem much older than any of them. Because for most of human history, other people were not background characters. They were infrastructure. Other humans helped you find food, share information, watch for danger, care for children, recover from injury, and decide whether you still belonged. So understanding another person's intentions was not merely socially useful, sometimes it mattered enormously. An argument could end in minutes, while its consequences continued much longer. Are they still angry? Did I misunderstand them? Will this damage the relationship? Should I repair it? What happens if the subject comes up again? The event may be over. Its consequences may not be. That gives the old argument a reason to remain computationally interesting. Not because yesterday can be changed, because tomorrow's relationship still can. The problems have modernized. The underlying uncertainty remains. The tribe became an office. The campfire became a group chat, and social ambiguity acquired Wi-Fi. A short email, a delayed reply, a manager who writes, "Can we talk?" A partner who says, "I'm fine," in a tone suggesting the available evidence does not support that conclusion. The system investigates uncertainty because uncertainty can contain information. But there is an important limit. Not every replay is useful. Sometimes the simulation generates a new interpretation, a better strategy, a boundary you failed to express, something you genuinely need to say. Other times, nothing changes. The same argument runs again, same accusation, same response, same ending. The engine is running, but the model is no longer updating. That is where rehearsal can begin to resemble rumination. A useful system can still become stuck, which gives us a better question than, "Why am I still thinking about this?" Ask instead, "Is this simulation producing anything new?" If it is, perhaps the system is still learning. If it isn't, perhaps the case is already closed, even if the engine has not noticed. One final inconsistency remained. Humans can rehearse a conversation 20 times, and reality can ignore every version. The other person says something unexpected. The perfect comeback is never needed. The conversation lasts 4 minutes instead of 40. If the engine exists to predict conversations, it is remarkably bad at its job. Unless prediction was never the job. Imagine rehearsing a difficult conversation for days. You prepare objections, responses, possible endings. Then the real conversation arrives. Almost none of your predictions come true. Different words, different reactions, different sequence. Prediction failed, and yet the situation may still feel strangely familiar. Not because you knew the script, because you had rehearsed the terrain, the tension before speaking, the uncertainty after saying something difficult, the possibility of being misunderstood, the need to adapt when the response you expected never arrives. A flight simulator does not need to predict the exact weather of a future flight to be useful. Its purpose isn't to predict the exact flight. It's to let the pilot practice responding to situations before they happen under real stakes. Perhaps imagined conversations can sometimes do something similar, not to predict exactly what another person will say, but to prepare you to respond when they say something you didn't expect. The purpose of the simulation may not be accuracy, it may be readiness. Remember, Kay? 18 simulations, 6 minutes of reality. Almost none of the dialogue matched, but I told you there was one detail I had set aside. When the real conversation finally happened, Kay described something unexpected. Familiarity, not the words or the sequence, but the experience. The tension before saying something difficult, the pause while waiting for a response, the need to adapt when reality ignored the script. The simulation had failed to predict the conversation, but perhaps it had prepared for the experience of being inside it. Case File 4, Revised Classification. The original diagnosis was incomplete. Anxiety can intensify the loop. Rumination can keep it running long after it stops producing useful information. But neither explains the full behavior. Beneath them is a broader capacity, reconstructing past social experiences, modeling other minds, and generating possible futures before reality supplies the answer. Prediction remains imperfect, sometimes spectacularly so, and now the shower looks different. At the beginning of this investigation, you appeared to be trapped in the past. Trying to manufacture the perfect sentence after the moment to use it had disappeared. But follow the sequence. The argument happens. Your response fails. Time passes. The world becomes quieter. The memory returns. A better response appears. You insert it. The other person reacts. You adapt. The conversation moves beyond anything that actually happened. Past becomes possibility. Possibility becomes rehearsal. And rehearsal becomes preparation. The edit is not for yesterday. It is for the next time. That does not mean every imaginary argument deserves to continue. Some simulations teach while others loop. The difference is not whether the conversation is imaginary, it is whether the simulation is still learning. So, return to the shower one last time. Steam on the mirror. Water on the tiles. The person from 3 days ago is still not there. You deliver the sentence you wish you had found at the time. They answer inside your head. And this time, you answer back. For a moment, it feels like you're rewriting history. You're not. Tuesday is gone, but the operating system may still be extracting something from it on Friday. A clearer response, a pattern, a warning, different strategy, or simply practice staying inside uncertainty long enough to respond. So, when the perfect comeback arrives several hours too late, notice what happens next. Does the model change? Does the rehearsal move forward? Or does the same argument simply begin again? Because the shower argument looks backward. But sometimes, the system running it is preparing for whatever comes next.